Okay, today's bonus lecture is on materials in Revit. And this is the materials library. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And one thing starting out here, you can sort this library by the different types of material. So for example, if you're just looking for metal, you can sort it by metal. And you can even further sort the library by choosing only materials that are in your model and already in use. Sometimes, as in the case of this model, it actually doesn't make any difference because a lot of the materials get used inside things like wall construction. Anyway, or you can just show all. And most of you, when you show your materials in your model, when you create a new one, you just come down here and you choose Create New Material. And what you'll see is the materials properties. And sometimes this is visible even when you aren't creating a new one. But not everybody knows that you can, well, obviously you can change the name of the material. So if I wanted to call it like, let's see, copper mesh maybe, how about that, copper mesh, that you can change the classification of the material. And again, if you have a lot of materials in your materials library, it's not a bad idea to do that. And now if I were to sort this by, say, metal, my new custom material shows up here, copper mesh. I tend on the graphics tab to use the render appearance. That way, as I modify the render appearance, it will change the color to be kind of an average of whatever image I happen to be using. And now here's my render appearance preview. Now what you'll see, the generic kind of material that you get from Revit has a number of parameters, a number of things that you can change, which are kind of standard. And of course you all know you can go and change the material to some color, or you can swap out an image. Okay, so I could choose some image. You can also change some more subtle things, for example, reflectivity, transparency, cutouts, self-illumination, which is a good one, bump maps, and tint. Okay, now this is the generic material. So sometimes when I have a material I'm creating that I know it's similar to another material, I go and I borrow from the Autodesk Materials Library. I borrow a material because I find it's much more precise and realistic if I use one that already is made than if I try and start recreating the exact amount of reflectivity and transparency that you might see in a particular material. So to do that, and many of you have learned this, that you can click the Replace This Asset button, and that opens up the asset browser. And Revit has, depending on your install, you might have several different libraries. Now, I strongly recommend that you always use the materials library that is the appearance library. There are several other ones, and I even have my own that I've created. Oh, except it's not there, but it's already open, and it's called the Brody Custom Materials. And I strongly recommend, if you use a lot of similar materials over and over again, that you do that. You create your own library, mainly because then it can be backed up, and it's easier to find these custom materials. But anyway, using ones from the Autodesk Appearance Library, these are materials that are optimized for rendering, so they're really much more sophisticated than I'm probably going to get if I poke around in the settings myself. So I'm going to try this copper polished material here. Now, when I use that standard material, what you'll see is that there are different parameters that are available for that particular material. And to make it attach it to my material in my model, I just double-click on it here in the asset browser. And if you look at that as compared to, say, Paint, what you'll see with Paint is it's a much more generic kind of base. However, even Paint has a number of features that are unique to the Paint material. For example, some of the highlights and some of the glossiness and things like that. That's pretty typical of Paint, as opposed to copper, which obviously doesn't have highlights like that. For copper, the highlights are handled in a different manner. Anyway, let's go back. I'm going to apply the polished copper. What you'll see, first of all, is it now shows up here, and it even says up here, copper polished. If in my appearance library I click the document assets. Those are the assets, the material definitions that happen to be in this particular model. And here it is, the copper polished one. Let me just close out of this. Now, when working with materials, there's a couple things that are super helpful. One of them is to just make the image a lot bigger. It will slow down your computer a little bit. However, now you can really see the material much more accurately. The other thing is I like to use an object, a preview object that is closer to whatever it is I'm going to be using this material for. So for example, if I was applying it to a small piece of furniture, I might use a vase or a table to show the material, especially if it's something curvy versus something flat. The other thing is you can change the render settings to be a much higher quality. I tend to use the medium quality because my laptop only goes so fast. And of course, the bigger the image, the slower the render time is going to be. Anyway, metals are really interesting because when you use them, they have a lot of standard features that are kind of related to metal. For example, there's one called patina, which is something you might see on copper. And just by dragging the slider, you can start to add some, essentially some wear to the material. Not everybody likes that, of course, and fully shiny is pretty optimistic. Anyway, you can also change things to be brushed versus semi-polished versus polished. Now, one thing that people do get into trouble with is if you look up here, my asset for this particular mirror is called the copper-polished material. If I change this to brushed, I can get into trouble because I may have another copper that uses that same copper asset. So what I strongly recommend, so for example, let's say I'm duplicating this and I'm going to call this one copper, brushed. Oops, not brushed, brushed. I would want to make sure, here's my brushed copper, I want to make sure that I use the brushed material here. The only trick is now on my mesh, I want my mesh to also to be a polished color or finish. But you see how it says brushed here? And the reason is because I'm using the same asset for both of these. What you need to do, and this is, I see this commonly when people create new paint colors from old ones, and then all the paint colors change. Just choose the duplicate asset button. What that does, see now this one uses the asset called copper polished 1. Now when I change this material to polished, you will see that this one retains the polish. The brushed material will look like it's got the brushed applied to it. Okay, so anyway, all right, let's come in here. That's one of the features you can change. Now, one of the other things is all the metal materials have some really nice base relief patterns that you can use that are actually kind of interesting. And for example, I'm going to use this knurled relief pattern here. And I'm just going to change my render settings to be draft so it speeds up a little bit. And what's nice about this, you can change the amount of knurling. Just take a quick look, and that makes them much more, I don't know, knurly. But you can also change the scale, which is kind of cool. Again, because sometimes you want a much finer pattern or a less fine pattern. Okay. Anyway, and then there's knurling. There's a number of other ones. For example, diamond plating. This is going to look kind of like metal panels that you would see on the ground. Here, let's make that, change the scale. Well, we'll leave that. But anyway, these are, again, standard patterns that you can use. Now, of course, what we love to do is use custom images for these patterns because we're just all into doing custom stuff. So if I do that, when I choose custom image, I can browse for an image. And here I've got one of some stripes. Let me just open that up, show you what that looks like. And you see how now I can create a pattern that's kind of interesting that is based on that image. And you can control how much or how little the relief pattern is displayed. The big thing with these custom images is that you need to use images that are what's called seamless. If I take a look at this image, there is a little white bar here that, of course, we're not seeing. When you use a material in Revit, it basically tiles that image. It creates many copies of it, and it puts the next copy right over next to the first copy. So you need an image which is designed to be seamless so that there's no joint visible. And a lot of you, when you create wood flooring or something like that, that's a problem that you see. So my advice is search for seamless materials. The other thing is, when you create these images, and you could create one using this Scribble image. This is in color. When Revit needs an image for creating a cutout or a bump pattern, for a cutout, it needs a totally black and white image. So you need to use Photoshop to create that black and white image, and we learned some techniques for that. For things like a bump map, a grayscale image is fine. The darker it is, the more bumpy that part is, but that you'll want a grayscale image. For a cutout image, you pretty much always want either black or white to make it work properly. Anyway, so here's my image. If I want to fiddle around with that, I can change a number of features. The relief pattern is only one of the options. There's also cutout, and again, this is another one of those things where there are standard patterns that you can use, and you can change these patterns. Of course, I can change the circle size to be bigger or smaller, and the image will adjust, and you can see this is you can start to create some really interesting materials, or you can use and like the other like the relief pattern, there's a lot of standard ones. Let's use a custom one and choose an image, choose my seamless stripes, and what you'll see is a striped vase. Okay, and these images, if you just double click on the image, there are a number of properties that you can change. For example, you can add things like tinting. You can, if you link transformations, that's really good if you're having the same or similar image in multiple elements, say a relief pattern and a color pattern. Anyway, you can also change its size or scale either using by changing the numbers in these parameter boxes here. So if I change this size to be, say, 1,000, you'll see, first of all, the image changes up here. It actually shows you what kind of repeat pattern you're going to get. And then you can modify it to really kind of tweak exactly what it is. In fact, you can even change the angle of the image. Come down here, and where's the angle? There we go. And I can do it, typing it in, or dragging the slider. Okay, and again, these are fun things that you can change. You can also lock the image so that it's a little harder to change. So anyway, you can really create some fun options that way. And let me just render this in the production quality, as big an image as I can get. And this will give you a terrific kind of preview about what your image is going to look like, what your rendered material is going to look like for your final version. And of course, there are a number of other parameters that we can change. This one only has the tint. If you're finding you're not getting all the materials that you want, all the parameters, you can try one of the different ones, but I would strongly recommend, again, using the asset library and using some of these standard material features. You can avoid having to model a lot of geometry just by kind of clever use of materials. It does mean that you have to know how to use Photoshop in order to transform the images into something Revit can use. And here you can see the final rendered image at the highest quality setting. Again, I strongly recommend checking this out, especially if you have a material that's very important to you, doing this high quality preview before you're done.